Listening Library presents What is the Story of the Wizard of Oz by Kirsten Anderson, illustrated by Robert Squire. What is the story of the Wizard of Oz? The very high point, the moment everyone in the audience waits for, in one of the most popular musicals on Broadway, comes as a young woman stands alone on stage. She begins singing about how tired she is of trying to do what others want her to do and be who they want her to be. It's time for her to believe in herself and to fight for what she thinks is right. Many of the people in the audience share her struggle. They too want to believe in themselves, but may not have the confidence. They feel just like the young woman singing, "Everyone deserves the chance to fly." And then she rises into the air and flies, and their spirits soar with her. This isn't just any young woman. She has green skin, wears a tall, pointy hat, and holds a broom. She is a witch, the evil witch who battled Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. But this is Wicked, the hit musical that tells the true story of Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West, and her friendship with Glinda, the Good Witch. In this version, Elphaba is a star, and she is not as wicked as she appeared in The Wizard of Oz. This is Elphaba's big moment, where she sings Defying Gravity. The song and the flying are the high points of the show, and something audiences cheer every night. Wicked opened on Broadway in 2003 and has been attracting huge crowds ever since. But the story of Oz, the witches, Dorothy, and the wizard goes back even further, beyond the famous 1939 movie where Dorothy is the hero who sings about finding a special place over the rainbow. Even earlier than 1900, when a book called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was published and became a beloved classic. It goes back to the 1800s to a little boy with a big imagination who had nightmares about being chased by a scarecrow. Chapter 1. Frankie. Lemon Frank Baum was born on May 15th, 1856, in Chenango, New York. His parents were Benjamin and Cynthia Baum, and he had 2 sisters and 2 brothers. Frankie, as he was known, was lucky to survive. He was born in the middle of a diphtheria epidemic. 2 of his cousins and his 3-year-old brother had died from the disease, which is a very serious infection. Right around the time Frankie was born, the Baums had another son, Henry, known as Harry, in 1859. 1859. The Baums did not have much money when Frankie was very young, but then Benjamin started working in the oil business and became wealthy. In 1861, the family bought a mansion in the city of Syracuse, and 5 years later, the Baums moved to a grand estate called Rose Lawn just outside of town. In the fall of 1868, 12-year-old Frankie was sent away to military school. He hated the rules and strict teachers. In 1870, he became sick at school and collapsed. His family took him home for good, which was fine with Frankie. He much preferred life at Roselawn, where he could read the fairy tales he loved and daydream as much as he wanted. Not all of his dreams were good, though. For a while, Frankie kept having the same nightmare. A scarecrow was chasing him through the fields around Roselawn. Just as it was about to catch him, it would collapse into a pile of straw and clothes. He never forgot that dream. When Frankie was 14, his father bought him a small printing press. He and his brother, Harry, began to print the Roselawn Home Journal, a newspaper for the family. They wrote stories, news, and puzzles for it. Frankie also wrote poems and stories for himself, and even started a novel. In 1873, a financial crisis struck the United States. All over the country, people lost money, businesses, and their homes. Benjamin Baum was deeply in debt and out of money. 17-year-old Frankie had to drop out of school and go to work in a store owned by his older sister and her husband. Frank did not like working in the store. He had always loved the theater, and in 1878, he decided to go to New York to become an actor. He got a few parts in plays, but wasn't earning enough to make a living. He left New York for Bradford, Pennsylvania, where he worked on a weekly journal. Eventually, his father let him manage a group of theaters he still owned from his wealthier days. And Frank started his own theater company. In 1882, Frank wrote a play called The Maid of Erin. He also played the lead role. The play was popular and was performed around the East Coast and the Midwest. That year, Frank married Maud Gage, a well-educated young woman. In 1883, Maud gave birth to their son, Frank Jocelyn. Frank wasn't making enough money with his theater company, so he went into business with his older brother, Benjamin Jr. They sold a type of oil that helped machines run smoothly. Maud and Frank had another son, Robert Stanton, in 1886. Afterward, Maud had to spend months in bed. Frank took care of Frank Jr. and Robert and became very close to his sons. Frank and Benjamin's business wasn't doing well. Maud's brother Clarkson and sisters Julia and Helen had moved out west to the territory that would become North and South Dakota. Their letters to Maud had made life in the West sound exciting. Maybe a little too exciting. Helen described a frightening cyclone that lifted a house right off the ground. Frank's business in Syracuse wasn't very successful, so in the fall of 1888, he decided to move his family to Aberdeen, South Dakota. Chapter 2. Aberdeen. Everything in South Dakota was much different from the life Frank knew back east. The Dakota prairie was flat and open, filled with empty land and big sky. Aberdeen was a fast-growing town, though. New people arrived all the time, and houses and businesses were popping up quickly. Frank decided to open a store. Baum's Bazaar sold fancy things like lamps, tea sets, gold pens, and gold toothpicks. For children, there were dolls, bicycles, and train sets. At first, the store was a success, but a drought struck the area in 1889. Crops didn't grow, and suddenly no one had money to buy much at all, let alone fancy china and gold toothpicks. The store closed on January 1st, 1890. Frank then started a newspaper called the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer. The paper was popular, but the town was still struggling. The drought went on and on. Businesses failed and people left. In 1891, the Baums moved to Chicago. Frank worked as a buyer for a department store, then as a traveling salesman for a glass and china company. He was often away from home. Frank and Maud had 2 more sons, Harry and Ken. Frank loved the nights he could spend at home telling stories to his sons. When he was on the road, he wrote down ideas for new stories. He invented new lands and strange creatures who did magical things. He began to write stories and poems for adults too. In 1897, Frank published a book called Mother Goose in Prose. Frank's stories answered the questions his own children had asked about the old Mother Goose rhymes, like why the old woman who lived in a shoe had so many children. Frank followed up his first book with another collection of stories called Father Goose, his book. These stories and poems were similar to the old fairy tales he read as a child. Children's books in the 19th century. In the early 1800s, books of fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm were very popular, as were the stories of Hans Christian Andersen. Later, writers were strongly influenced by fairy tales and began to create their own. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, written by Lewis Carroll and published in 1865, it was one of the most popular children's books of its time. It wasn't a story about dragons or castles or lost fortunes, though. This was a child's book that went in a new direction. Imaginary talking animals and silly adults teased Alice with confusing rhymes and puzzles. The stories and the tone of the Alice books influenced many writers, including Frank Baum. But Frank wanted to make them more modern. He wrote about kids flying through the sky in fantastic machines rather than fighting dragons. A friend introduced Frank to an illustrator named W. Denslow, who was known for his funny, lively drawings. Frank showed some of his new stories to Denslow, and he agreed to illustrate Father Goose. Father Goose was published in 1899. To Frank's surprise, it was a hit with both readers and critics. Suddenly, he was a successful children's author. But he didn't have much time to think about his success. He was busy finishing a new book. It was about a girl who was carried away to a strange new land. He named the land Oz. W. Denslow, 1856 to 1915. William Wallace Denslow attended both the National Academy of Design and the Cooper Union in New York. Denslow, often called Den, worked as an artist and newspaper reporter around the country until 1893. When he decided to settle in Chicago after visiting the World's Fair, he was best known as a poster artist, but also illustrated books. He earned enough money as an artist to buy an island in Bermuda. Then he crowned himself King Denslow I, monarch of Denslow Islands and protector of coral reefs. Chapter 3. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz tells a story of Dorothy, a little girl who lives on the dull gray prairie of Kansas with her Aunt Em and Uncle Henry. One day, a strong rotating wind called a cyclone picks up their house and carries it away, with Dorothy and her dog Toto still inside. The house drops down in Munchkin Land, a beautiful place where the grass is green and flowers were blooming. Dorothy is cheered by the Munchkins because the house landed on their enemy, the Wicked Witch of the East. The Good Witch in the North arrives and tells Dorothy she should take the Wicked Witch's silver slippers, as they are very powerful. When Dorothy asks which way is the road back to Kansas, the Good Witch tells her to follow the yellow brick road to the Emerald City. There, the Wizard of Oz might be able to help her. She gives Dorothy a kiss, and that kiss leaves a small mark to show that the Good Witch is protecting her. Dorothy and Toto set off, and along the way, they meet a scarecrow who wants brains, a tin man who is looking for a heart, and a lion who wants to become more courageous. They join her in the hope that the wizard might be able to grant their requests. They battle fierce tiger bears called Kalidas, escaped a field of deadly poppy flowers, then finally make it to the Emerald City. The wizard appears in different shapes to each of them and tells them he will help them if they kill the Wicked Witch of the West. She is a sister of the witch whom Dorothy's house landed on back in Munchkin Land. The worried friends set off to find her, but the Wicked Witch sees them coming and sends her winged monkeys after them. The monkeys injure the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman. They capture Dorothy, Toto, and the lion. The Wicked Witch sees the Good Witch's mark on Dorothy and realizes she can't hurt her. But she does try to steal the silver slippers. Dorothy becomes angry and throws a bucket of water at the witch. To her surprise, the witch melts. Dorothy frees the lion and the enslaved Winky people. She is reunited with the Scarecrow and Tin Woodman, and the group of friends return to the Emerald City. The Wizard of Oz is now invisible. The friends speak up, telling the wizard that they killed the Wicked Witch of the West and asking him to grant their wishes. He tells them to come back the next day. While they argue with him about when he will keep his promise, Toto runs to the back of the room. He knocks over a screen and reveals a frightened little old man. He admits that he is actually the wizard. He arrived in Oz when a hot air balloon he was riding in for a circus act in Omaha blew away. The people of Oz assumed he was a wizard, and he continued to use some of his circus tricks to keep them believing he was magical. The wizard decides to fly his balloon back to the United States with Dorothy, but in a cruel twist, he accidentally lifts off without her. Dorothy is crushed, thinking she will never get home. Then, an Oz soldier suggests that she visit Glinda, the Good Witch of the South. Glinda explains to Dorothy that all she ever needed to get back to Kansas were her silver slippers. Dorothy says goodbye to her friends. Then, holding on to Toto, takes 3 steps. Dorothy whirls away and lands back in Kansas, where she finds Aunt Em, and Dorothy tells her how glad she is to be back home. The geography of Oz. The country of Oz is roughly shaped like a rectangle and divided into 4 parts. To the east is Munchkin Land, and to the west is the land of the Winkies. The Quadlings live in the south, and the Gillikins in the north. Quadlings live in the south, and the Gillikins in the north. The Emerald City is in the very center of the country. The people in each region are represented by one specific color. Their clothes and anything they make is that color. The Munchkins' color is blue. The color of the Winkies is yellow. The Quadlings live in a land of red, and the Gillikins in a land of purple, and of course the Emerald City is green. Frank had started out wanting to create a fairy tale like the ones he had loved when he was young. But his was an American fairy tale based on the America Frank knew. The dull gray prairie where Dorothy lives was like Aberdeen, South Dakota, during the drought. The Munchkins' rich, blooming farmland was the prairie and Midwest at its best, full of growth and opportunity. The deep forest Dorothy and her friends crossed was like the ones Frank played in as a boy in upstate New York. The Emerald City was as dazzling as any of the cities growing quickly across the United States. And the creatures Dorothy met were not elves or fairies, but everyday things, a scarecrow, something made of tin, and an animal. And Dorothy felt similar. Dorothy felt familiar too. She wasn't a princess stuck in a castle. She was an American girl who relied on herself like the people who went out west and tried to make a new life on the prairie. Like them, she solved her own problems and stood up for herself. When she saw someone in need, like the Scarecrow, Tin Woodman, or the Cowardly Lion, she helped them, just the way someone in Kansas or South Dakota or Pennsylvania might help their neighbor. After seeing exotic, beautiful places with gleaming cities and roads made of gold, she still wanted to go home to Kansas. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was published in May 1900. The New York Times said it was a book that rises far above the average children's book of today and praised its bright and joyous atmosphere. The reviewer thought that it would be strange if there would be a normal child who will not enjoy the story. And the reviewer was right. By Christmas 1900, the book was a bestseller. Chapter 4. The Royal Historian of Oz. A theater producer in Chicago decided to turn The Wonderful Wizard of Oz into a musical. The play was very different from the book, though. In the stage version, Dorothy was a teenager with a pet cow named Imogen. She traveled to Oz with a waitress named Trixie. There was a large chorus of singing and dancing girls, fancy sets, and impressive special effects. The Scarecrow and Tin Woodman were played by a popular comedy team who did a lot of clowning around. But when The Wizard of Oz opened in June 1902, audiences loved it. The production toured North America for about 8 years. Frank earned a lot of money from the success of the musical and the sales of his book, but he spent more than he made. He decided to write a sequel to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Frank and W. Denslow had argued about profits from the Oz stage musical and didn't want to work together anymore. The new book was illustrated by a different artist, John R. Neal. The Marvelous Land of Oz was published in 1904 and became another big bestseller. Children had been waiting anxiously for more stories about the Land of Oz. Frank hoped that he could turn it into another successful musical. He wrote the script himself and named it The Wogglebug, after the most popular character in the new book. It opened in June 1905 and was a huge flop. Frank knew that nothing he wrote was as successful as the Oz books, and although he didn't want to write more about Oz, he needed the money. Ozma of Oz was published in 1907, and Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz in 1908. He called himself the Royal Historian of Oz. The Road to Oz was published in 1909, and The Emerald City of Oz is in 1910. A book that Frank thought would be his last Oz book. Frank and Maud moved to California to help pay off some of his debts. Frank signed over the copyrights, the legal right to publish, to his early books, including The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. That meant he would not earn any more money from his most famous book. Frank wrote other stories that were not about Oz or the original characters, but readers just wanted more Oz, and Frank needed to earn a living. So he went back to writing about Oz. The Patchwork Girl of Oz was published in 1913. It was about Scraps, a fun-loving patchwork girl quilted together from old pieces of cloth. It was Frank's best-selling book in years. The interesting characters of Oz. With each book, Frank introduced a few new characters. Here are three of the most famous. Scraps. The Patchwork Girl is a teenage girl sewn together from scraps of cloth. Her hair is brown yarn. Her eyes are buttons, and her teeth are made from pearls. She is known for her enthusiasm and love of dancing and jumping around. Tick-Tock is a mechanical man. He is built like a wind-up toy with 3 keys, one for thinking, one for speaking, and one for moving. Each key needs to be wound in order for him to function completely. The Wogglebug is an ordinary insect who lives in a schoolhouse, so he is very smart. He becomes human-sized during a schoolroom experiment that goes wrong. Chapter 5. A New Historian. In 1914, Frank and 3 friends formed the Oz Film Manufacturing Company. They built a huge studio and made 3 films: The Patchwork Girl of Oz, The Magic Cloak of Oz, and His Majesty the Scarecrow of Oz. Frank worked very hard on the films, spending long days and nights at the studio. He helped with the building of the sets and invented special effects that created a magical world. Everything about the movies was of the highest quality. But the films failed. At that time, no one made films just for children. Adults who went to the Oz movies were disappointed that they had paid to see what they considered to be a simple fairy tale. Many demanded their money back. Theaters refused to show the films. The failure of the films upset Frank deeply. He had put so much effort into them and was very proud of them. He gave up on film and theater. From now on, he would just write his books and tend the flowers he loved in his garden. Between 1915 and 1919, Frank wrote 5 more Oz books. His heart weakened, and he died on May 6, 1919. He was 62 years old. He left behind manuscripts for 2 more Oz books. The Magic of Oz was published in 1919, and Glinda of Oz came out in 1920. Riley and Lee, the book's publisher, didn't want the series to end, though. They decided to find a new writer to take over and become the next Royal Historian of Oz. William F. Lee, the vice president of the company, noticed the stories of a writer named Ruth Plumley Thompson on the children's page of a Philadelphia newspaper. He thought they were very imaginative and written in a lively, fun style. Riley and Lee offered Ruth Thompson a contract to write 1 new Oz book a year. Ruth had grown up reading the Oz books and was thrilled by the offer. She accepted, and her first book, The Royal Book of Oz, was published in 1921. She went on to write 18 more Oz books. Like Frank, she enjoyed creating new, fun characters. She invented Pegasus, the flying pig who loved poetry, Richard, who had an arm that could stretch to reach anything, and Sir Hokus of Pokes, an elderly knight from the time of King Arthur who was still ready to fight dragons. Kids loved Ruth's new books, and she wrote 1 a year until 1939. But then she didn't write any more Oz books until the 1970s. Yet Oz became more and more popular throughout the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. The land and characters created by Frank won new fans in ways that he would have appreciated, on screen and on stage. Chapter 6, Oz and the Silver Screen. In the 1910s and 1920s, movies were in black and white, and they didn't have a soundtrack. They were silent. Actors pretended to speak, but audiences couldn't hear them. Instead, they watched the expressions on the actors' faces and their gestures to try to understand the story. Sometimes title cards with words on them appeared on screen. They showed the most important parts of the conversations or gave details that audiences might not figure out on their own. In 1925, there was a new movie version of The Wizard of Oz. Like the other Oz plays and movies, the plot was very different from the book. And like the other Oz films, this one also was a failure. It seemed that no one could get the Oz story quite right when making a movie about it. Silent movies began to disappear after 1927, when A Jazz Singer was released, a movie with a recorded sound. Soon, studios were making all kinds of talking pictures, including musicals with lots of singing and dancing. They still weren't interested in children's movies or fairy tales, though. But in 1937, a movie came along that made everyone change their minds about fairy tale films. It was Snow White, Disney's animated version of a classic story. To everyone's surprise, it was a huge hit. Suddenly, all the big movie studios began to look for fairy tales and children's stories that they could turn into their own Snow White-sized hits. 5 different studios offered to buy the rights to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from producer Sam Goldwyn, who had bought them from the Baum family a few years earlier. He sold it to the highest bidder, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM, for $75,000 in 1938. MGM's motto was "All the stars that are in heaven," and the studio bragged about having the biggest stars in Hollywood under contract. Not so silent films. Silent films weren't always silent. Many of them were shown with live music. In the early 1900s, theaters began to hire piano players or organists to play during movies, mostly to cover up the sound from the noisy film projectors. At first, musicians just played whatever they wanted, but filmmakers soon realized that music could be used to help tell the story. It could make a chase scene more exciting, or make a love scene more romantic. They hired composers to write music, especially for the movies. The movie reels would arrive at the theater with a set of sheet music and a list of musical cues telling the piano player what and when to play. The movies themselves may have been silent, but thanks to local musicians, they were never dull. Today, an actor, writer, director, or crew member will sign a contract to make a single movie. But in the 1930s and 1940s, most people signed a long-term contract with a studio. The studios always had numerous movies in production. When actors finished one film, they often went straight into preparing for another. Meanwhile, set designers, carpenters, seamstresses, and musicians worked non-stop, creating everything that was needed to make many movies at a time. By the late 1930s, MGM was completing one movie every 9 days. MGM was one of the biggest and best studios in Hollywood. When they got the rights to the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, there was no question that would be another spectacular MGM hit. It was, but there were lots of bumps in the yellow brick road along the way. Chapter 7. We're off to see the wizard. MGM decided that The Wizard of Oz would be a musical, with plenty of singing and dancing, and it would be in color. In 1938, color movies were still very new and exciting. Some executives at MGM wanted Shirley Temple to play Dorothy. 10-year-old Shirley had been one of the biggest stars of the 1930s. The executives thought she would help make the movie a hit, but Shirley was under contract to another studio. Shirley, yeah. And they would not loan her to MGM. Instead, the role of Dorothy went to 16-year-old Judy Garland. She had been at MGM since 1935, but had been in only a few films. Many people at the studio didn't think she looked like the other glamorous MGM stars. However, Judy had an amazing singing voice. People in the music department at MGM knew she was special. They thought the role of Dorothy would be a chance to show everyone what Judy could do, and that getting the role could help turn her into a star. Judy Garland, 1922 to 1969. Frances Ethel Gum sang on stage for the first time when she was just 2.5 years old. After that, she began to perform with her older sisters as an act called the Gum Sisters. In 1934, the girls changed their name to the Garland Sisters. Soon afterward, Frances changed her name to Judy. After appearing in The Wizard of Oz in 1939, Judy became one of the studio's biggest stars. But she struggled with the dependence on drugs and alcohol. She began to show up late to film sets or not show up at all. Before she was 30 years old, MGM ended her contract. Judy continued to make movies, but she really became a new kind of star. Singing on the concert stage, her shows were an event. People lined up in the streets to buy tickets, and the crowds cheered for her throughout her performances. The biggest moment of each show was when Judy sang Over the Rainbow, her special song from the movie that had made her famous.